Sometimes, the smallest question reveals the emptiest place in a human heart. No one expected silence to become the loudest sound in the grand ballroom that evening. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors, a string quartet drifted softly through the air, and nearly 300 guests filled the annual Hope Horizons Children's Foundation Gala with elegant laughter and practiced smiles. Cameras flashed every few seconds as business leaders, celebrities, and donors gathered around the evening's guest of honor, Daniel Carter, the 42-year-old CEO whose name had become synonymous with innovation, generosity, and impossible success. Magazine covers called him America's most admired executive. Financial reporters admired his discipline. Investors admired his vision. Yet no article had ever managed to explain why the man rarely smiled unless someone else was looking away. Tonight was no different. Dressed in a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo, Daniel greeted guests with warm handshakes and polite conversation, thanking each supporter with the same calm voice he used in boardrooms worth billions of dollars. His smile was flawless, but somehow distant, like sunlight reflected on frozen water. Beside the stage stood a long line of children from the foundation, each waiting to receive scholarships, books, and winter care packages before posing for photographs with the evening's sponsors. Most of them giggled nervously as volunteers straightened collars and brushed loose strands of hair from their faces. Daniel shook every small hand with gentle courtesy, kneeling briefly so they wouldn't have to look up at him. The audience applauded each interaction, believing they were witnessing another successful charity event. Then everything changed. At the very end of the line stood a little girl in a pale blue dress that had clearly been mended with loving hands more than once. She couldn't have been older than 7. Soft blonde curls rested against her shoulders, and she clutched a tiny silver star-shaped hair clip between both palms as though it carried every ounce of courage she possessed. While the other children hurried toward the photographers, she stayed perfectly still. One volunteer whispered that it was her turn. Another offered a reassuring smile. The little girl nodded but didn't move. Instead, she looked directly at Daniel with clear blue eyes that seemed far older than childhood should allow. He noticed her almost immediately. There was no panic in her expression, no expectation of gifts, no excitement about standing beside a famous millionaire. There was only quiet hope. Daniel stepped away from the cameras and walked toward her, assuming she might be frightened by the crowd. The conversations around the ballroom softened. Even the musicians seemed to drift into the background as he crouched until they were nearly eye level. "Hi there," he said gently. "I'm Daniel. What's your name?" The little girl took one careful breath. "Sophie," she answered, her voice barely louder than a whisper. She twisted the little silver star in her fingers before looking back into his eyes. "Mr. Carter." She hesitated just long enough for the entire room to lean closer without realizing it. "Could I have one hug, just like a daughter?" Every camera stopped flashing. Every conversation disappeared. Even the clinking of silverware faded into stillness. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes rested on the tiny silver star trembling in her hands, and for the first time in years, something carefully buried behind success, routine, and polished composure began to move beneath the surface of his heart. Daniel could hear nothing except the quiet rhythm of Sophie's breathing as she waited for an answer that seemed far too large for someone so young to ask. Around them, hundreds of people stood perfectly still, uncertain whether they were witnessing an ordinary moment or the beginning of something none of them would ever forget. His eyes drifted from the little silver star resting in her hands to the hopeful expression she tried so hard to keep steady. It reminded him of another smile, another pair of bright blue eyes, another little girl who used to reach for his hand without asking permission because she had never imagined a world where she would be turned away. For years, Daniel had buried those memories beneath endless meetings, cross-country flights, quarterly reports, and the comforting noise of constant achievement. Success had become his shelter because silence always led him back to the life he could not rebuild. Every morning began before sunrise with the same routine. Coffee that often grew cold before he finished it. A calendar filled from 6 o'clock until evening. Conversations measured in contracts, forecasts, and deadlines. Employees admired his fairness. Shareholders trusted his judgment. Reporters praised his discipline. Yet every evening he returned to a penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline where the lights below seemed warmer than the rooms inside his own home. There were no family photographs on the shelves. No toys tucked beneath furniture. No childish drawings held to the refrigerator with colorful magnets. Only carefully chosen artwork, spotless glass, and the quiet echo of footsteps across hardwood floors. His assistant had once suggested placing fresh flowers in the living room to make the space feel more welcoming. Daniel smiled politely and thanked her, but the flowers disappeared after a week because there was no one else there to notice them bloom. Even holidays passed like ordinary workdays. Thanksgiving dinners were delivered but rarely touched. Christmas gifts arrived from business partners and remained unopened until January. Birthdays came with speeches from executives and handwritten cards from employees, yet none of those thoughtful gestures ever reached the empty place he carried within him. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that staying emotionally distant protected him from losing anything ever again. It seemed easier to offer donations than affection, scholarships than memories, opportunities than attachment. The foundation gala had been added to his schedule months earlier because supporting children had always been one promise he refused to break, even if he kept his heart carefully guarded while doing so. He believed writing generous checks was enough. He believed kindness could remain professional. He believed compassion had safe boundaries. Then Sophie had stepped in front of every expectation he had built around his life with one impossibly simple request. She had not asked for money. She had not asked for a scholarship, a bicycle, a vacation, or a miracle. She had simply asked to know what it felt like to be held as though she truly belonged. Daniel slowly reached toward the tiny silver star she still held between trembling fingers. "That is a beautiful clip," he said softly. Sophie glanced down and smiled with quiet pride. "It was my mom's favorite," she whispered. She said stars help people find their way home. Something inside Daniel shifted so gently that no one else could have seen it, yet to him it felt as though the carefully locked doors around his heart had begun opening one by one, allowing a warmth he had almost forgotten still existed. Sophie lowered her eyes for a moment, gently turning the little silver star hair clip between her fingers as though it carried memories too precious to lose. Daniel remained kneeling before her, unaware that every person in the ballroom was still watching, yet somehow the crowd had disappeared from his mind. There was only the little girl standing a few feet away and the quiet weight behind her simple request. "My mother used to say that hugs make people remember they are not alone," Sophie said softly. "After she went to heaven, I tried to remember how one felt." Daniel swallowed carefully, unable to find words. Sophie continued with the calm honesty only a child could possess. "I thought maybe I was forgetting." Her voice never trembled. She was not asking from desperation. She was speaking with the gentle hope of someone who still believed kindness existed, even after life had changed in ways no child should have to understand. Daniel glanced toward the volunteers standing nearby. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Grace, offered him a small, encouraging smile through misty eyes. She had cared for Sophie at Hope Horizons for almost a year. Grace quietly stepped closer, careful not to interrupt the moment. "She practiced that question for weeks," she whispered. Every Wednesday after school she would stand in front of the mirror and ask it over and over. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she cried. She was always too nervous to finish. Daniel looked back at Sophie, surprised. "You plan to ask me?" Sophie nodded shyly. "I read about you in the library. They said you help lots of children." She paused before adding, "I thought maybe someone who helps children would know how a father hugs his daughter." The words settled over the ballroom like gentle snowfall. Several guests quietly wiped tears from their eyes. A photographer lowered his camera, realizing that no picture could fully capture what was happening. Daniel felt something inside him soften with every sentence she spoke. Success had taught him how to negotiate billion-dollar agreements, solve impossible business problems, and speak confidently before thousands of shareholders. Yet nothing in his life had prepared him for one little girl asking him about something that could never be measured on a balance sheet. He noticed the careful stitching along the sleeve of her pale blue dress and the polished shoes that had clearly belonged to another child before they became hers. Everything about Sophie reflected gratitude instead of complaint. Even now, she was smiling gently, almost afraid she had asked for too much. Daniel remembered all the expensive gifts he had received over the years: watches, paintings, luxury cars, invitations to exclusive events. None of them had ever carried the value of the tiny silver star she refused to let go. "Did your mother give that to you?" he asked quietly. Sophie smiled with unmistakable pride. "On my 6th birthday," she answered. "She told me whenever I felt lonely, I should look at the stars because love always finds its way back." Daniel looked into her bright blue eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the carefully built walls around his heart no longer felt like protection. They felt like a prison. He slowly opened his arms, not out of obligation, not because hundreds of people were watching, but because something deep within him finally understood that some children do not ask for miracles. Sometimes they only ask for a moment that tells them they belong somewhere in the world. For one long heartbeat, neither of them moved. Daniel's arms remained open, not as a gesture prepared for cameras or charity events, but as an invitation offered with complete sincerity. Sophie's eyes searched his face, almost asking one last time if he truly meant it. When she saw the quiet smile that reached his eyes instead of stopping at his lips, she took a careful step forward, then another. The tiny silver star was still resting safely in her hand as she slipped into his embrace. She did not rush. She did not leap. She simply leaned against him with the cautious trust of a child who had learned that the most precious things in life should never be taken for granted. Daniel wrapped his arms around her with remarkable gentleness, careful not to hold her too tightly, allowing her to decide how close she wanted to be. The ballroom seemed to disappear entirely. The applause that had filled the evening only minutes before gave way to complete silence. Even the musicians lowered their instruments without being asked. Nobody wanted to interrupt a moment that felt too honest for words. Daniel closed his eyes for the briefest instant. He had expected the embrace to comfort a little girl. Instead, it was his own heart that seemed to remember something it had forgotten years ago. There was no business strategy in this moment, no carefully planned speech, no expectation of recognition. There was only the simple warmth of another human being reminding him that love could return quietly, without announcement, when someone chose courage over fear. Sophie smiled against his shoulder, her voice almost too soft to hear. "Thank you," she whispered. "That feels exactly how I imagined it would." Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had spoken before presidents, investors, and audiences of thousands without hesitation, yet he found himself struggling to answer one grateful little girl. Finally, he managed to say, "You never needed permission to be treated with kindness." Sophie slowly stepped back, still smiling, while keeping one small hand wrapped around the silver star. She looked brighter somehow, as though a tiny piece of hope had finally settled where loneliness used to live. Around them, guests quietly reached for handkerchiefs and tissues. Several volunteers embraced each other. A young violinist near the stage brushed away tears before gently lifting her bow once more. One photographer, who had spent the evening chasing perfect publicity shots, lowered his expensive camera and simply watched. Then, almost instinctively, he lifted it again and captured a single photograph just as Daniel looked at Sophie with a tenderness that surprised even himself. There was nothing dramatic about the image. A successful man in a tuxedo. A little girl in a carefully mended blue dress. A silver star catching the light between them. Yet everyone who witnessed the moment understood they were seeing something far greater than a charity event. Grace quietly approached Sophie and knelt beside her. "Are you ready for the rest of the program?" she asked gently. Sophie nodded, but before turning away, she looked back at Daniel one more time. "I almost did not ask," she admitted with a shy laugh. "I was afraid you would be too busy." Daniel smiled with a warmth that felt unfamiliar and wonderfully real. "I think," he replied softly, "this was the most important part of my evening." As Sophie walked toward the other children, Daniel remained exactly where he was, watching the little silver star sparkle beneath the ballroom lights. For reasons he could not yet explain, he realized he did not want this to become a beautiful memory that faded with tomorrow's headlines. For the first time in many years, he wanted to know the story behind a child, not because she needed help, but because somewhere deep inside, he already sensed that their paths had crossed for a reason neither of them fully understood. Soon after the final applause faded and the guests slowly returned to quiet conversations, Daniel found himself unable to leave the ballroom. For years he had attended charity events with practiced grace, shaking hands, making generous donations, delivering hopeful speeches, and returning to work before the emotions of the evening had time to settle. Tonight was different. His eyes kept searching the room until they found Sophie sitting at a small round table with several other children. Carefully smoothing the wrinkles from the pale blue dress she wore as though it were the finest gown in the world. Every few moments her fingers touched the little silver star hair clip before she smiled to herself. It was a tiny gesture, but Daniel noticed it every time. Grace approached him quietly, holding a simple manila folder against her chest. "I thought you might want to know a little more about her," she said gently. Daniel accepted the folder without speaking. Inside was not a complicated case file or pages filled with legal language. There were only a few photographs, school reports, and a folded sheet of notebook paper written in careful pencil. The first page explained that Sophie had been living at Hope Horizons for nearly 11 months after losing the only parent she had ever known to a long illness. Her teachers described her as thoughtful, curious, and unusually kind to younger children. She loved reading, drawing stars in the corners of her notebooks, and volunteering to help organize the library shelves after class. Grace smiled softly as Daniel continued reading. "She is always the first one to comfort another child who is having a hard day," she said. "Even when she is the one who needs comforting." Daniel turned to the folded paper. "May I?" he asked. Grace nodded. "She wrote that a few weeks ago. She said it was a letter to her mother. She never intended anyone else to read it, but yesterday she told me that if someone ever truly wanted to understand her, I could share it." Daniel unfolded the page with remarkable care. The handwriting was small but steady. "Dear Mom, I hope heaven has stars that look like the ones we watched together. I still wear the silver star because it makes me feel like you are close. Everyone here is kind, but sometimes I wonder what it feels like to belong to someone again. I do not need toys or big presents. I just wish one person would look at me the way fathers look at their daughters when they know they are coming home together. Maybe one day God will answer that prayer. Until then, I will keep smiling because you always said hope grows when people share it. Love, Sophie." Daniel lowered the letter slowly. His vision blurred just enough that he had to blink before reading the final line once more. The room around him continued with gentle laughter and quiet music, but everything felt strangely distant. He looked across the ballroom where Sophie was helping a younger boy straighten the ribbon on his gift bag before handing him an extra cookie from her own plate. She did it naturally, expecting nothing in return. Daniel realized that despite everything she had lost, she had somehow protected the most beautiful part of herself. He carefully folded the letter exactly as he had found it and slipped it back into the folder. Then he looked at Grace with a quiet determination that had nothing to do with business or charity. "Would it be all right," he asked softly, "if I came back next week to visit her?" Grace's eyes brightened with gentle understanding. "I think," she replied, "she has been hoping someone would ask that question for a very long time." The following Tuesday arrived with a clear autumn sky stretching above Chicago, the kind of bright morning that made even familiar streets seem filled with quiet possibility. Daniel canceled 2 meetings that his assistant had spent weeks arranging, something he had never done without an urgent business reason. When she looked at him with gentle surprise, he simply smiled and said, "Some appointments matter for reasons that cannot be measured on a calendar." Less than an hour later, his car pulled into the parking lot of Hope Horizons. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no reporters, and no photographers. Only a modest brick building surrounded by colorful flower beds that volunteers had planted during the summer. Daniel stepped inside carrying nothing more than a canvas tote filled with library books, a small puzzle, and a sketchbook with a box of colored pencils. Grace greeted him with the warm smile he had begun to recognize. "She has been checking the front window every 10 minutes since breakfast," she whispered. Before Daniel could answer, a familiar voice echoed down the hallway. "You came back." Sophie stood near the doorway wearing a yellow sweater over her favorite blue dress, the little silver star, now clipped carefully into her hair instead of resting in her hand. Her smile was brighter than anything Daniel had seen in the boardrooms that filled his ordinary life. "I said I would," he answered. "I try very hard to keep my promises." Sophie walked beside him into the reading room where sunlight spilled across wooden shelves filled with well-loved books. They spent nearly an hour reading stories aloud, taking turns giving different voices to every character until both of them laughed whenever one of the silly animals appeared on the page. Daniel realized he could not remember the last time laughter had come so naturally. Afterward, Sophie opened the sketchbook and began drawing a night sky filled with stars. Daniel watched quietly until she handed him a blue pencil. "You have to draw one too," she said. "Stars look happier when they have friends." He hesitated before carefully adding a single bright star beside hers. Sophie studied the page with great seriousness before nodding with satisfaction. Now they both have someone. The words settled gently into Daniel's heart. Over the following weeks, Tuesday afternoons became something both of them quietly anticipated. Sometimes they visited the neighborhood library, where Sophie eagerly introduced Daniel to her favorite stories. Sometimes they walked through a nearby park, collecting colorful leaves and guessing what shapes the clouds resembled. Other afternoons they baked chocolate chip cookies in the community kitchen, laughing whenever flour somehow ended up on both of their sleeves. Daniel noticed changes in himself that no quarterly report could ever record. The coffee waiting on his office desk no longer grew cold because he actually remembered to drink it. He smiled more often during meetings. Employees remarked that the entire office felt lighter without understanding why. Even the flowers in his apartment stayed on the table week after week because now he paused long enough to appreciate them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Daniel found the sketchbook resting on the passenger seat beside him. He opened it at a red light and smiled at the page where 2 blue stars floated side by side across a childlike sky. Beneath them Sophie had written in careful pencil, "Some families begin with hello. Ours began with a hug." Daniel closed the sketchbook gently, holding it with the same care he had once used for Sophie's letter. For the first time in many years, the drive home no longer felt like a journey back to an empty apartment. It felt like carrying a small piece of hope with him wherever he went. Winter arrived quietly, wrapping the city in crisp mornings and golden afternoons that seemed to slow the pace of everyday life. Nearly 3 months had passed since that unforgettable evening at the gala, and Tuesday visits had gradually become part of a rhythm neither Daniel nor Sophie could imagine losing. What began as an unexpected friendship had settled into something much deeper, built not through grand gestures but through countless ordinary moments. They had finished 6-chapter books together. They had baked enough cookies for every child at Hope Horizons twice over. They had even created a tradition of drawing one new star in the sketchbook after every visit, each one representing a memory they wanted to keep forever. Grace often smiled as she watched them from across the room. "She laughs differently when you are here," she told Daniel one afternoon. "Children can tell when someone truly chooses them." Those words stayed with him long after he returned home. One evening, standing beside the wide windows of his apartment, Daniel looked out over the lights of Chicago and realized the silence no longer comforted him. It reminded him of someone who was missing. Without overthinking the decision, he called his attorney the following morning and asked a question he had never imagined asking. What would the process look like if I wanted to become Sophie's legal guardian? The attorney paused for several seconds before answering with thoughtful professionalism. It is certainly possible, she explained. But there will be careful evaluations, interviews, background reviews, and court approval. Every decision will focus entirely on Sophie's best interests. Daniel nodded even though she could not see him. That is exactly how it should be. News of his intention quietly reached Hope Horizons a few days later. Grace hugged Sophie gently before explaining that nothing would happen overnight and that many adults would ask questions before any decision could be made. Sophie listened carefully, holding the familiar sketchbook on her lap. Does that mean Mr. Carter might stop coming? She asked in a voice barely above a whisper. No, Grace answered immediately. If anything, it means he is trying to find a way to keep every promise he has already made. Sophie smiled, but uncertainty still lingered behind her eyes. As the weeks passed, social workers visited Daniel's home, spoke with colleagues, neighbors, teachers, and volunteers. They observed his visits with Sophie, noting how naturally they talked, laughed, and solved little puzzles together. During one visit, Sophie proudly showed everyone the page with 2 blue stars drawn side by side. That one is him, she said, pointing to the larger star. And that one is me. We never leave the page without drawing them together. Most of the conversations were encouraging, yet not everyone welcomed the growing bond. A distant relative from Sophie's mother's extended family learned about the situation and unexpectedly expressed interest in becoming her guardian. The woman insisted that family connections should come before any relationship formed later in life. There was no anger or hostility, only a sincere belief that biology alone should determine where Sophie belonged. The court agreed that every possibility deserved careful consideration before making such an important decision. When Grace gently explained that the process might take longer than expected, Sophie looked down at the silver star clipped into her hair. She quietly removed it and held it in her palm, just as she had on the night she first met Daniel. Do you think stars ever get lost? She asked. Grace knelt beside her and smiled warmly. No, she replied. Sometimes clouds make them harder to see, but they are always exactly where they belong. Sophie closed her fingers around the tiny silver star and nodded slowly. That evening, Daniel received a simple drawing in the mail. It showed 2 blue stars separated by soft gray clouds, yet both still shined brightly. Beneath the picture Sophie had written in careful pencil, I know you are still there. I will keep looking until the sky is clear again. The morning of the final hearing arrived beneath a clear blue sky, and sunlight poured through the tall courthouse windows with a quiet warmth that made the marble hallways feel less intimidating than Sophie had imagined. She sat beside Grace on a polished wooden bench, wearing the same pale blue dress she had worn the night her life first crossed paths with Daniel. The little silver star rested carefully in her hair, catching tiny flashes of light whenever she turned her head. Across the room, Daniel looked toward her and smiled with calm reassurance. There were no dramatic speeches waiting to be delivered, no promises designed to impress. Over the past several months, he had already shown the court who he was through consistency, patience, and every Tuesday afternoon he had chosen to spend beside one little girl. The judge listened carefully as social workers, teachers, counselors, and volunteers described the remarkable bond they had witnessed. Sophie's teacher explained that her confidence had blossomed. Grace spoke about the laughter that had slowly replaced the quiet loneliness she once carried. Even Daniel's assistant shared how the atmosphere inside the company had changed because its leader had rediscovered joy in ordinary moments. The relative who had come forward also spoke respectfully, expressing sincere care for Sophie's future. The courtroom remained thoughtful and compassionate throughout the proceedings, focused only on one question. Where would Sophie feel most loved, most secure, and most at home? Finally, the judge folded her hands and looked kindly toward the little girl. "Sophie," she said gently, "would you like to tell us how you feel?" The room became wonderfully still. Sophie looked first at Grace, then at Daniel. She slid carefully from her chair and walked across the polished floor until she stood only a few feet away from him. Daniel remained seated, uncertain whether she wanted him to say something. Instead, Sophie smiled. Softly, just as she had on the evening they first met. Without speaking another word, she opened her small arms. Daniel's eyes filled with quiet emotion as he slowly knelt before her. This time, Sophie did not hesitate. She wrapped her arms around his neck with complete confidence, resting her cheek against his shoulder exactly as though she had always belonged there. The courtroom watched in complete silence. No one interrupted. No one looked away. After a long, peaceful moment, Sophie whispered clearly enough for everyone to hear, "The first time I hugged him, I was hoping someone would make me feel like I belonged. Now I already know where home is." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, holding her with the same gentle care he had shown from the very beginning. When they finally stepped apart, the little silver star shimmered beneath the morning sunlight. The judge smiled warmly before looking down at the papers on her desk. "Love is not measured by how long people have known each other," she said. "It is measured by the safety, trust, and hope they build together every single day." She signed the final document with a quiet stroke of her pen. It is the decision of this court that Sophie's permanent guardianship is granted to Daniel Carter. For just a heartbeat, no one moved. Then quiet tears, grateful smiles, and gentle applause filled the courtroom. Daniel looked at Sophie, unable to find words large enough for the moment. Sophie simply reached into her pocket, took out the sketchbook page with the 2 blue stars, and slipped it into his hand. Looking up at him with complete certainty, she smiled and said, "See? The clouds always moved away." 1 year later, spring sunlight poured through the tall windows of the very same ballroom where everything had quietly begun. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled above polished marble floors, the string quartet still filled the room with gentle music, and families once again gathered for the annual Hope Horizons celebration. Yet this year, something felt wonderfully different. There was no lonely man standing politely at the center of the room while keeping his heart carefully guarded behind perfect manners. There was no little girl wondering whether she belonged to anyone. Daniel and Sophie arrived together, hand in hand, smiling before they even stepped through the doors. Sophie's pale blue dress had been carefully preserved, but today she wore a new white cardigan over it, and the little silver star still rested proudly in her hair. Daniel glanced down at her with quiet affection as she pointed excitedly toward the stage where children were hanging colorful paper stars across the backdrop. "They remembered the stars," she whispered with a smile. Daniel nodded. "Some things are worth remembering forever." Throughout the afternoon, Sophie eagerly introduced Daniel to every child who had joined the foundation during the past year. She knelt beside the youngest children, tying loose shoelaces, sharing cookies, and reading picture books exactly as Grace had once watched her do. Daniel noticed how naturally she welcomed every child who looked uncertain, offering them the same kindness that had once changed his own life. Grace quietly walked over and smiled as she watched them together. "You know," she said softly, "when Sophie first arrived, she believed families were something that happened to other people. Now she spends every day helping other children believe they can have one too." Daniel looked toward Sophie with grateful eyes. "She has taught me much more than I could ever teach her." Later that afternoon, the foundation unveiled a new reading room dedicated to children discovering hope through stories. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign that read, "The Silver Star Library." Inside, framed on the wall beside rows of books, rested the first sketchbook page Sophie had ever drawn with 2 small blue stars shining side by side across a quiet sky. Beneath the picture appeared a single handwritten sentence in Sophie's careful printing. "Some families begin with hello. Ours began with a hug." Guests paused to read it, smiling as they continued through the room. As evening settled outside, children gathered near the windows to watch the first stars appear above the city skyline. Sophie slipped her hand into Daniel's and looked upward. "Mom was right," she said gently. "Stars really do help people find their way home." Daniel smiled before kneeling beside her, just as he had on the night they first met. "I think your mother gave you something even brighter than a star," he answered. "She taught you how to keep hope alive long enough to share it with someone else." Sophie leaned against him without asking permission because she no longer needed to. Home was no longer a wish written in a letter or a dream carried inside a little silver star. Home had become the quiet certainty that someone would always be there when she reached out her hand. Across the ballroom, laughter echoed warmly through every corner of the building, and Daniel realized that success had never been the greatest achievement of his life. The greatest gift had arrived in the form of one courageous little question that had changed two hearts forever. Sometimes the richest person in the room is not the one with the largest fortune, but the one who finally learns that love grows stronger every time it is freely given. And sometimes all it takes to begin a family is one small act of kindness, one promise faithfully kept, and one hug that says, without a single doubt, you are finally home.